From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. And I'm Luke Jones.
In 1980, the Solidarność, or Solidarity trade movement, formed in the old Lenin shipyard in the Polish port of Gdańsk on the Baltic Sea.
Oliver Moody is Berlin correspondent for The Times, and recently he's been writing about Poland.
Mamy prawo do strajku.
And its leader, this fantastically mustachioed and charismatic electrician called Lech Wałęsa, who was prone to quite fanciful flights of rhetoric, stood up in front of the striking workers and he said, "One day we are going to build a second Japan here in Poland." And the crowd fell about laughing because in 1980 it was unthinkable that this dysfunctional economy racked with scarcities could rival the modernity of what was back then the rising economic power of the world, Japan. But it very much looks as though this year that is exactly what the country is going to do.
Poland's economy is booming.
In the second quarter of this year, Poland recorded the EU's fastest GDP growth.
Not comfortable with a trajectory that will soon see Britain overtaken by Poland.
Poland has transformed itself into a powerhouse with a thriving tech sector, one of the busiest ports in Europe, and the kind of economic growth Rachel Reeves would give an arm for. In the past, Poles would leave for work, to the UK perhaps. Now, they're flooding back.
15 years ago, Polish workers came here to find opportunity. Now, Poland is growing twice as fast as we are.
So how did this happen? How did Poland go from a post-Soviet basket case to a country whose living standards are actually better than Japan's? And is there a catch? The story today: why are so many Poles returning home? You're Berlin correspondent, Ollie. Why Poland? Why are you interested in what it's up to at the moment?
Well, I am indeed in Berlin, but my job also takes in northern and central Europe, all the way up to the Russian border. And in the 7 years that I've been here, Poland has established itself as an absolutely indispensable European power, really increasingly on a par with the likes of Italy or Spain, if not kind of playing in the same league as France and Germany. So you have to understand it if you want to understand where Europe is at today.
Which is what we're going to do. I just wonder if you can lay out what Poland looks like at the moment, because here in the UK, I think we have a sort of slightly sniffy attitude of thinking it's a middling economy, the kind of place where people emigrate from rather than emigrate to. But what is the state of things at the moment?
Poland is a developing economy still, in the sense that it hasn't yet reached the equilibrium point where it's maximised its potential. Its structure is still changing in terms of the things that it makes and the skill sets of the people who make them. But it is increasingly a prosperous place with a tremendous level of pride and confidence and a very high level of technological readiness, especially in some commercial sectors.
Prosperous in what way? To what extent?
Prosperous in the sense that if you take the average Polish household and what they can buy with the money they get in a year, and then you go to an average British household outside London, it's very nearly the same. As in, the effective standard of living is basically comparable to Britain's if you exclude London.
And in terms of other comparisons to other nations, we heard a moment ago about comparisons to Japan. I mean, how far is it on its mission to beat them?
Well, if you believe the International Monetary Fund, this year, Poland's GDP will surpass $1 trillion, and its GDP per capita in purchasing power parity terms, which is a bit of a mouthful, but basically just means how much bang you get for your buck. It's due to surpass Japan this year, then in the next few years, it's going to surpass Spain and Israel and New Zealand. And it's a bit harder to see past 2030. But if current trends do continue, which is a big if, it might very well surpass the UK.
And the benefit of that is being felt in lots of places, I mean, particularly in schools.
That's right. The international PISA rankings, which are about as close as an objective yardstick for teenagers' educational performance as you can get, put Poland's scores in core subjects, so maths, Polish, and science, ahead of those in, for example, Sweden or Denmark or Germany. And they're actually right behind the UK now.
This is having an impact on migration as well. We here in the UK seem to think of Polish people wanting to leave to make a better life, but actually the reverse is true now, is that right?
It certainly was the case that after Poland joined the EU in 2004, there was a gigantic movement of workers into Western Europe, into Germany, France, the UK. But that demographic tide has now gone into reverse. So over the 12 months to June, 25,000 Polish nationals left the UK and only 7,000 moved in the opposite direction. And this year, we've just seen that migration flow go into reverse with Germany as well. So this great return is very much a phenomenon now in Poland, and it's a great source of pride to the government and the public.
We actually spoke to one Polish citizen who has made this great return, Agnes Uber.
Hi, I'm Agnes Uba. I was born in Warsaw in Poland. Why did I move to UK? So actually I moved because I was pursuing education opportunities. Somehow I always had very strong sentiment towards UK. I went there when I was 16 for like a language camp, and since then I just loved it. I did my bachelor, did my master's. Then I managed to get a job, which I was super happy in London, which was super competitive back then. London offered everything. Every single career you wanted to pursue, it had there for you. On top of that, you could network with everyone. You have all events you wanted to go to. To me, I was in the center of everything. After Brexit, things began to change when it comes to the IT and technology and AI industry, because, any innovative industry doesn't like uncertainty, right? I would just hear more and more stories from my friends. It's awful. We don't know what's going to happen. My company think that they will do massive layoffs. They cannot keep foreigners right now. We don't know what's our visa situation. So people who are working with me in tech, they were like, we cannot stay in London. Like, this is just not working for us now. When I was, happy in the UK, I didn't even ask about people in Poland, how do you live? Like, how's it going? Is it actually okay? Like, I just didn't care really because I was very happy in my own London bubble. But when that wasn't an option anymore, then I was looking around. And then it's appeared to me that actually Poland is doing really well. And, it's been already 10 years since I moved from Poland. So I had this 10 years of missing information on the country. I moved back to Poland in late 2018, and Poland was extremely hungry for innovation and all the newest trends. You can feel it on every single everyday level. For example, we would get the newest restaurant concept that you can order from tablets. Our bank is super innovative. We have also a lot of digitalized services for the citizens. We have a government app with my national ID, with my driving license. I can report a car accident over there. It's just so convenient. I didn't have that many Polish friends in the UK, but the few I had, they did come back to Poland. It was also due to economical reasons, because actually, we have right now a lot of cool career opportunities that we wouldn't have in the UK, and the salary also kind of increased over the last 10 years. Also, the issue for us was actually the cost of living, right? And the housing problem. We're all at the beginning of our career, and you want to start saving for a house, and you just couldn't in London. When my friends from UK and from Germany started visiting me in Poland, that's when I saw the contrasts, and when they were actually pointing this out for me, I realized, we did make a massive progress. We are actually in a really cool place right now, so maybe I should be proud.
Who are the big success stories in terms of employers, though, that people might be staying to stick and work with? I mean, do they have a sort of JCB, Rolls-Royce kind of equivalent?
They have a lot of very high-end manufacturing. You could think, for example, of Stellantis in the northwestern city of Szczecin, which makes electric vehicles and has just signed a deal with NVIDIA to roll out robo-taxis.
And also names of brands that we actually would recognise around the world have originated in Poland.
That's absolutely correct. So you could think, for example, of computer games, where CD Projekt Red, which started out as a kind of bootleg label distributing foreign games for a Polish audience and translating them, acquired the rights for a fantasy novel series called The Witcher, and it's now shifted 90 million copies around the world and inspired a very successful Netflix spin-off series.
I've heard tales of your kind, Witcher. I thought you'd have fangs or horns or something.
I had them filed down.
And InPost started off again as a kind of very small logistics firm. Their big thing was automated parcel lockers, which are actually a German technology, but as with so many of these things, InPost took that technology and just did it cheaper and better and at greater scale than the competition, with the result that they've now bought up 2 logistics companies in the UK. They've got about 12,000 lockers across Britain.
And it's a visible one as well. People will recognise those sort of big yellow banks of lockers that you see in various parts.
Yeah. And in January, when Keir Starmer went to Warsaw, one of the big announcements was that InPost was going to be spending another 600 million quid on its investments in Britain. And Starmer had this trumpeted from the Number 10 website as a sign that Britain was such an attractive place to do business.
Yeah, amazing. Do you feel the benefit of all of this walking around parts of Poland? I mean, does it feel like it is on the up when you go?
I was in Warsaw 3 weeks ago, and every time I go, the centre gets a bit more hipsterized.
Yeah.
Coming from Berlin, actually, the way it feels most unusual is the level to which everything is digitized. How much of life is transacted through smartphones in a way that would be unthinkable in a German city today. But the place where it really hits you is actually in Gdańsk on the Baltic coast, which is becoming one of the biggest and busiest ports in Europe. And there's a lot of Chinese freight that's coming through it now. In fact, a few weeks ago, the first ever Chinese trading voyage via the Arctic landed in Gdańsk. So it's incredible how you can almost watch it developing every time you go.
Alongside all of this industrial and economic muscle, as you've explained, it is what you mentioned a few moments ago, which is this diplomatic renaissance that's happening. You constantly hear about Poland when we're talking about some of the big issues affecting Europe, and particularly with what's happening in Ukraine and issues of security. How has it come to that? Or is it just a fluke of it being, a neighbour of Ukraine?
No, it's not at all. It's by design. The first factor there is just geography, right? That it is inevitably the main logistical route for getting stuff into Ukraine, largely via Rzeszów on the border. The Polish military intelligence is incredibly well networked in Ukraine. So they do a lot of stuff behind the scenes for ensuring that these weapons get to where they're meant to go. But by far the biggest thing is just that Poland started rearming a long time before the rest of Europe. It's building what is probably the largest conventional military in Europe west of Ukraine and Russia. It is buying eye-wateringly large numbers of artillery cannon and tanks and attack helicopters and warplanes, which makes it a real power to be reckoned with. And there's no getting around it in Europe's current security architecture.
Let's think a bit about how all of this has happened then, because if you look through the history of Poland, I mean, it has been subjugated and chopped and changed and messed around with for centuries. If we just go back to the 80s, what was the country like then?
Maybe some of the people listening to this podcast might have seen Krzysztof Kieślowski's famous TV series Decalogue from the end of the 1980s, which is set in this incredibly drab, prefabricated housing block on the outskirts of Warsaw. And it really brings home what an alien world that was materially compared to what you could have seen in the West. One of the Polish businessmen I interviewed for this essay, Marcin Kotlarek, told me about his experience of growing up at this time in a town called Koszalin near the Baltic Sea, where there were just constantly empty shelves in the grocery stores. It was a massive event whenever there was a delivery of coffee. And it was considered an incredible treat if you got a set of sneakers, and they were all known informally as Adidasi, kind of pretend Adidas.
How did that then change, I guess, with the rise of the Solidarity movement and then eventually independence? I mean, things didn't turn around necessarily that quickly.
Yeah, so what happened was the communist regime in Poland had incredibly tight control over every aspect of the economy and managed it very badly to the point where it could no longer sustain the price controls, which prompted a lot of resentment. And in 1980, Lech Wałęsa and his fellow workers at the Lenin shipyard in Gdańsk decided to start a strike in protest at the mistreatment of one of their colleagues who worked as a crane driver. And this became the nucleus for one of the biggest popular movements in modern European history.
What began as an economic protest became a demand for sweeping political concessions.
Mamy prawo do strajku.
Together they formed a new movement, Solidarity.
For the first time, they had a taste of being citizens. For someone who had lived under communism, it was like a narcotic or fresh air.
It was an absolutely extraordinary phenomenon where you had a genuine alliance between the workers and the intelligentsia, and between the kind of leftist wing of the Polish public and, really quite dry right conservatives. And the government tried to squash it by imposing martial law in 1981, which didn't really work. And eventually it became clear that the government could no longer maintain that control over the population. And so Solidarność forced them to hold kind of semi-free elections in the summer of 1989. And that was significant because it was the first time one of the pillars of the Eastern Bloc had been toppled by popular dissatisfaction.
And then moving towards independence and beyond that, how difficult was that?
It was brutal. I mean, it was brutal across the entirety of what had previously been the Eastern Bloc, because their regimes had been effectively blanking out economic reality for decades. And the standard prescription was shock therapy. So just, open everything up to capitalism. And as in so many Eastern European countries, that resulted in unbelievably brutal levels of inflation. I think it peaked at about 580% in 1991. There had been formerly almost no unemployment. The unemployment rate went up to 16%. If you just imagine the damage that rupture does to a country's social fabric, it was genuinely traumatic, I think.
But then how did Poland sort of navigate all of that and not end up like a sort of Ukraine, where in that rush to capitalism, you get oligarchs?
They had a number of very gifted economists who were brought in to run the transition with outside advice, including from Jeffrey Sachs, who's later become quite an influential advisor in the Trump administration, and interestingly also from Zani Minton-Meadows, who's now the editor of The Economist. And in particular, there was one guy who spoke to us for the essay, Leszek Balcerowicz, who was a New York-educated economist. He'd previously actually been an advisor to the communist regime, but he'd been so disgusted by martial law that he switched sides to Solidarność. And what they did differently to a lot of their neighbours was, first of all, to invest a lot of political capital in building independent institutions on the Western model. So not just an independent judiciary, but also regulators and ombudsmen with real teeth. They did privatization instead of doing it all in one go, which would have allowed the emergence of oligarchs. They did it through a system of vouchers like in Estonia, which meant that it was sort of generally a better distributed affair. And most controversially, they opened up the economy very radically to foreign investment, with the result that by the end of this process, out of the 100 biggest companies in Poland, 87 were in foreign hands.
In your Times essay, you characterise this as out-Thatchering Thatcher.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate description. And for a lot of them, Thatcher was an ideological heroine. I mean, this is literally how Donald Tusk put it to us, not just in terms of her Big Bang free market economic policies, but also in terms of her strident anti-communism.
So in 2004, of course, Poland famously joined the EU. Many of us on the UK side of things will remember all of that for what it meant for the free movement of people and lots of Polish people coming to the UK. What did it mean for Poland?
Yeah, well, about 2 million people left Poland in the years after that. And in the opposite direction came a gigantic flood of EU funding, which was worth up to 3.5% of national GDP in some years. And that transformed Poland's infrastructure for the better, but also the erosion of what had previously been barriers to trade and investment really kind of turbocharged business innovation, with the result that you started to get these businesses expanding into Western Europe.
But then I guess that was taken a lot of sound politics and prudence, that could have been scuppered by politicians. Why has that not happened, do you think?
The really interesting question is there have been other tiger economies in the former Eastern Bloc that had a very good and well-managed transition, but effectively stopped growing after the financial crisis. And the classic example of that would be Estonia, which was wildly successful from 1991 to 2008, but has basically flatlined ever since. And to be quite honest with you, none of the people that we spoke to had a really good and convincing holistic explanation for what had happened differently in Poland. But what has certainly been the case is that the growth has just continued with an almost metronomic consistency right throughout the Eurozone crisis. Even in the first year of the pandemic, GDP only shrank by 2% and then bounced back. There's an incredible level of resilience, which might have something to do with the size of the domestic workforce or the kind of level of education and skills, but that would be speculation on my part, really.
Part of this success is also, and I don't know how much of this is a stereotype, although I did have my dad yesterday tell me within all sincerity that Polish tilers are fantastic. We sort of associate them with a great work ethic, and they will just dedicate themselves to things and do jobs very well. I mean, is that a stereotype or is that an actual phenomenon and part of the ongoing success?
It is a stereotype. It's also a stereotype that a lot of Poles have about themselves. Most of the people that my colleague Bartosz and I spoke to when we were researching this essay mentioned what they felt was a really unusual drive and entrepreneurial spirit and a willingness to just stay and keep plugging away until you got the job done. You can quantify it. It is real. The average working week in Poland is one of the longest in Europe. It's 38.9 hours. So that's 5 hours longer than in Germany, for example. I think it can genuinely be characterized as an economic miracle, but there are certain structural factors whirring away under the bonnet that do raise some reservations about how much longer this can continue and whether at some point this sustained growth ends up being like Wile E. Coyote running off a cliff where the legs are still going, but at some point gravity is going to kick in.
Ollie, we're talking about Poland and what is changing and what is growing and what is booming there. We were talking earlier on about how for a long time, especially since Poland joined the EU, it's been a great phenomenon of Polish workers moving to the UK to try and earn more and make a better life for themselves. That is now somewhat going in reverse.
Yeah, this was something that both Donald Tusk and Rafał Brzoska, the founder of InPost that we were talking about a moment ago, suggested, that it's not just that we're going to see more Polish nationals coming back to Poland from the UK, it's that there will be more Brits moving to Poland to seek their fortune. There is a estimate doing the rounds on the internet, you'll find it within a few minutes of Googling, that there are now 185,000 Brits in Poland, That is, as far as I can tell, complete cobblers. I don't know quite how it fixed itself in online folklore, but we did look into the statistics, and there are 6,600 British people in Poland now, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it has trebled over the last decade. So there are at least the makings of an emerging trend, perhaps.
Obviously, this episode is not sponsored by the Polish Tourist Board, so there must be some downside to all of this. What are the issues? What are the problems that persist now?
The biggest one is that for all that a moment ago we were patting Poland on the back for having avoided large-scale oligarchization like you might associate with Russia or Ukraine or even somewhere like Latvia or Hungary, there was a huge amount of economic disparity that resulted from the privatization process, especially in the 1990s. The basic fact is that for a lot of Polish people, especially those living outside the big cities, life got measurably and tangibly worse in the 1990s in financial terms. And that created a deep reservoir of resentment that has made Polish politics extremely polarized and volatile, really since the 2000s, and in particular with the emergence of the right-wing Law and Justice Party.
Since 2015, the right-wing Law and Justice Party has tapped into dissatisfaction with liberal Western values. But many here fear that what they regard as the authoritarian political party behind all this is hijacking the government by subverting the judiciary, muzzling the media, and curbing civil rights.
That has been a great structural difficulty for Poland that we're seeing now, in particular with Donald Tusk as the kind of centre right prime minister, having to live with a president who is from a significantly more right-wing perspective and largely dedicated to destroying Tusk's government from the inside.
What about some of the other social phenomena? You mentioned in your essay the fertility rate.
The collapse in the birth rate has been truly dramatic. In 1990, at the end of the communist regime, it was about 2 births per woman. Now it's 1.1. So it's nearly halved. It's one of the lowest in the EU. And combined with a traditional reluctance to accept immigration, at least mass immigration, particularly from outside Europe, that does mean that the workforce is projected to shrink by one of the largest margins in Europe.
And that is creating problems, but it means that it still relies on importing labour.
It does. And one of the kind of more easily overlooked realities of Poland's demography is that there are not just almost 1 million Ukrainians and something like 180,000 Belarusians, but also growing minorities of people from places like India and Vietnam, who in some cases have been there for quite a long time and settled and raised families and are now, to all intents and purposes, part of the Polish body politic.
What does that mean, though, in terms of how, especially when there are economic and social divisions and then now rising the amount of labour being imported, what does that do to social fabric? I mean, does that account for the rise of the right, the far right, concern about immigration, social cohesion? Immigration
is very intensely politicised, and to some extent it has contributed to the success of right-wing parties, but it's also been adopted very enthusiastically by the Tusk administration and by his party Civic Platform. So it's not just a kind of right-wing populist issue. And in terms of the social fabric, the welcome that the Ukrainian war refugees have received was initially very, very warm on the whole from Polish society. But there was also a very strong sense that the government had left Polish people to deal with it on their own, that they hadn't received enough support. And so a lot of tensions have begun to emerge around the Ukrainians who are still there in Poland. And there is certainly more resentment than there used to be in the past.
Just to end with, you were talking at the beginning of our conversation about some of the forecasted trends and, the uncertainty about whether it can keep all this momentum, economic and otherwise, going to 2030 and beyond. I mean, looking at how things are at the moment, do you think that this rise will continue and it will be a new superpower, or, will problems catch up with it at some point?
I find it very difficult to judge, to be honest. There are structural problems we haven't talked about yet. For example, the rate of investment is pretty low by European standards. The budget deficit is so big that even Rachel Reeves would have to go and have a cold shower and a lie down. It's 6.8% of GDP, which is the second highest in Europe. The demography is going to be a longer term problem, but at some point it is going to become a very serious problem unless there is a shift of policy on migration or some miraculous revival in the birth rate. So there are certainly strong countervailing forces against Poland's growth. But that said, there are also reasons to be optimistic, one of which is that the country, despite still burning gigantic amounts of coal, is going through an energy transition. It's installing very large amounts of renewable capacity. It's building its first nuclear power station. It's becoming an increasingly important route for trade, in particular via China's Belt and Road Initiative. And in the very long term, there is, I think, a vision of a Poland that occupies the same role in relation to its eastern and southern neighbours in the future that Germany has done over the past 20 years, as the kind of richer country that outsources a lot of its manufacturing in a very mutually beneficial way. There are obviously a lot of frictions on the path to that version of the future, in particular the fact that Ukraine and its accession to the EU pose in many ways a threat to large parts of the Polish economy. But it is certainly possible to construct a hopeful version of what Poland would look like in 10 or 15 years' time.
Oliver Moody, Berlin correspondent at The Times. You can read his and Bartosz Kilak's excellent essay on this subject right now over at thetimes.com if you have a subscription. And you can subscribe to this podcast for free wherever you're listening, and it will mean you will never miss an episode. That is it from us today, though. Today's producer was Harry Stott. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. And I'm Luke Jones.